I never thought that a quiet weekend at our house would turn into something that I'd struggled to make sense of for the rest of my life. It started with a seemingly innocent suggestion from my husband, Mark. He had invited his two closest friends, Ethan and Ryan, over for a barbecue. They had been like brothers since childhood, and their visits were frequent, always filled with laughter and warmth that radiated through the house. But that evening felt different from the start, like the air was charged with something unspoken, something that I couldn't quite place. Mark was in a playful mood, cracking jokes and pouring drinks, his deep laugh echoing across the yard. Ethan and Ryan were relaxed, leaning back in their chairs, the glow of the setting sun casting a warm, golden light over the scene. The summer breeze was soft against my skin as I moved around the grill, checking the steaks, and I couldn't help but notice how Ryan's eyes followed me as I passed, lingering a little too long. Ethan too, though quieter, seemed to steal glances when he thought I wasn't looking. It was subtle, but undeniable. I didn't know how to react to it. The way their attention felt more intimate, more focused than usual. Mark hadn't seemed to notice, or maybe he didn't care. He trusted them. He trusted me. After all, we had been together for years, our bond strong and unwavering, or so I had thought. As the night wore on, the mood shifted. After dinner, we moved inside, the warm glow of the fireplace dancing across the room as the night deepened. Mark and his friends had always been affectionate in their own way, playful banter and teasing thrown back and forth like second nature. But tonight there was something different in the air. I could feel it, simmering beneath the surface. At first, it was nothing but small gestures, Ryan leaning in a little closer than usual when he spoke to me, Ethan's fingers brushing against mine when he handed me a drink. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into their actions. But then Mark, with that easygoing smile of his, said something that sent a chill down my spine. "You know," he said, laughing, "I've always wondered what it would be like for the three of us to share everything." The room fell silent for a moment. I could feel Ethan and Ryan both stiffen slightly, their gazes flicking toward me, but it wasn't awkwardness that hung in the air. It was something else entirely. My heart skipped a beat, my mind racing to process what he had just said. Share everything? Mark laughed again, as though he had made a harmless joke, but the look in his eyes was something different, something more serious. And then I saw it, the way he looked at me, the subtle shift in his expression that made my breath catch in my throat. He wasn't joking. He was testing the waters, seeing how far he could push. My mind reeled, a flood of emotions hitting me all at once. Confusion, disbelief, but beneath it all, a flicker of something else. Something I didn't want to acknowledge. Ethan and Ryan said nothing, but their silence was deafening. The tension in the room thickened, and suddenly, every glance, every touch from earlier in the evening felt like a prelude to something inevitable. Mark stood up, stretching casually, as if nothing had changed, as if the weight of his words wasn't hanging in the air between us. "I'll grab another bottle of wine," he said, heading toward the kitchen. "You three enjoy yourselves." And just like that, we were left alone, Ethan, Ryan, and me, sitting in the dim light of the living room, the unspoken words swirling around us. I could feel my pulse quicken, my skin tingling with a nervous energy I couldn't control. Ryan shifted in his seat, his gaze locked on mine, while Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on his knees, watching me with a quiet intensity. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to break the silence. But I didn't have to. Because in that moment, I realized that none of us wanted to. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, and I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, two pairs, each carrying something unsaid, something dangerous. My heart was racing, a dull thrum in my chest, my breath shallow. I tried to focus on anything else, the flickering shadows from the fire, the soft hum of the wine fridge as Mark disappeared into the kitchen, but it was impossible. Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the silence just enough to pull my attention back to him. His gaze was steady, his eyes darker than I remembered. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quiet, but it carried a weight, as if the question wasn't just about this moment. It was about something much bigger, something I didn't fully understand yet. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was okay. There was a part of me that was screaming to stand up, to walk away, to stop this before it began. But there was another part, deeper, buried beneath the layers of doubt and propriety, that didn't want to move. A part that was curious. No, more than curious. A part that had been awakened by the looks, the touches, the unspoken tension that filled the room. Ryan shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine as he leaned forward. "You're not uncomfortable, are you?" His voice was soft, almost gentle, but his eyes held a challenge, as if daring me to say that I wasn't. And I wasn't, not in the way they thought. The discomfort was something else, something internal, warring between what was right and what I wanted in that moment. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. Before I could answer, Mark returned, carrying a fresh bottle of wine and 4 glasses. He set them down with a casualness that made my head spin, pouring the wine with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Everyone all right?" he asked, glancing between us, but his gaze lingered on me a moment longer. I couldn't read the expression on his face. There was no anger, no jealousy, just something else. Anticipation, maybe? Or something darker. I took the glass he offered, my fingers brushing his as he handed it to me. His touch was warm, familiar, grounding me for a moment in the reality of our relationship, our marriage. But even that comfort felt fragile now, overshadowed by the undercurrent that had been building all night. Mark sat down, closer to me than before, his arm casually draped across the back of the couch, fingers just grazing my shoulder. "You know," he began, his tone light but his words deliberate. "We've all been close for a long time. I trust Ethan and Ryan more than anyone. And I trust you." He paused, his fingers trailing down to the nape of my neck, sending a shiver through me. "I think it could be fun to explore that closeness together." My heart stuttered in my chest, and I felt the room tilt, the full weight of his meaning settling over me. He wasn't just testing the waters anymore. He was diving in, dragging me along with him. Ethan and Ryan said nothing, but I could feel their gazes, could almost hear their thoughts. My pulse quickened, the air between us electric, charged with a tension that I didn't know how to break. I didn't trust my voice, didn't trust myself to say the right thing, to stop this before it spiraled out of control. But when I looked at Mark, at the steady, knowing look in his eyes, I realized that it was too late. This wasn't just about him. This was about us. About something unspoken that had been building for a long time, something that I hadn't been willing to confront until now. Mark leaned in, his lips brushing my ear as he whispered, "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. But if you do, I want you to know I'm okay with it." His breath was warm against my skin, his words laced with something both comforting and dangerous. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, and set my glass down, my hands trembling slightly as I placed it on the table. Ethan's eyes met mine, and in them, I saw the same hesitation, the same uncertainty. But there was something else, too, desire. It was in the way his gaze lingered on my lips, the way his body leaned just a little closer, as if pulled by an invisible thread. Ryan, ever the more daring of the two, reached out first, his hand brushing against my knee. It was a light touch, barely there, but it sent a shockwave through my entire body. I froze, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of the 1,000 conflicting emotions coursing through me: guilt, excitement, fear, desire. Mark's hand stayed on my shoulder, a silent reassurance, a reminder that he was there, that he wasn't going to stop this. His touch was light, but it anchored me in the moment, kept me from spiraling into the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. Ryan's fingers slid higher, slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving mine. I could feel my breath catch in my throat, my skin burning where his hand rested, and for a moment, the world outside this room ceased to exist. It was just the 4 of us, tangled in something too complicated to name. Ethan shifted beside me, his gaze dark and unreadable. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear, his touch gentle, almost reverent. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it, but none of them seemed to notice. or care. The space between us, between what was right and what was happening, had vanished. I started, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't know what I was going to say, didn't know how to articulate the storm of emotions inside me. But before I could find the words, Ethan's hand cupped my cheek, his thumb tracing my jawline in a way that made my breath hitch. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice so low that it sent a shiver down my spine. "You don't have to say anything." And maybe he was right. Maybe words were unnecessary in this moment. Maybe there was no way to rationalize what was happening. All I knew was that, despite the war raging inside me, I didn't want to stop. I couldn't stop. Mark's fingers tightened just slightly on my shoulder, his silent approval hanging in the air between us, and I realized, with a dizzying certainty, that we had already crossed the line. There was no going back now. Ryan leaned in, his lips brushing against my neck, the warmth of his breath sending a wave of heat through me. I closed my eyes, my body trembling under the weight of everything I was feeling: guilt, desire, excitement, fear. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the way their hands felt on my skin, the way Mark's presence loomed behind me, watching, waiting, allowing this to unfold. I had never imagined myself in this position, never thought I would be capable of something like this. But as Ethan's lips found mine, soft and tentative at first, then more insistent, I realized that I had crossed the threshold that I couldn't come back from. Mark's hand slid down my back, and I felt his breath against my ear again, his voice low and filled with something darker, something I had never heard from him before. "I want you to enjoy this," he whispered, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of what that meant. Ethan's lips pressed against mine with a slow, deliberate pressure, and every second that passed felt like time was stretching and folding in on itself. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic rhythm that mirrored the swirling chaos in my mind. But even as my thoughts screamed at me to pull away, my body refused to obey. Instead, I found myself leaning into the kiss, my lips parting slightly as his mouth moved against mine, soft but demanding. The room seemed to shrink around us, the world outside nothing but a blur. The sound of Mark moving behind me, the soft rustle of his clothes as he leaned forward, his hand brushing against my back, grounded me. It was his presence, his quiet approval, that both terrified and emboldened me. When Ethan pulled back, his eyes searching mine, I saw the same conflict reflected there. He wanted this, and I could feel the heat of that desire burning between us. But there was something else, an uncertainty, a hesitation that mirrored my own. I could feel the weight of what we were doing, the impossibility of it all. Yet, despite the danger, the guilt gnawing at my insides, I didn't want it to stop. Ryan shifted beside me, his hand moving higher up my thigh, his fingers brushing the hem of my dress. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through me, a shock that radiated out from where his hand rested, spreading through every nerve in my body. His eyes were darker now, intense and focused, his lips parted slightly as he leaned closer, his breath warm against my skin. I could feel Mark behind me, his presence like a shadow, hovering at the edge of everything that was happening. His hand slipped from my back to my waist, and I felt him press closer, his breath hot against the nape of my neck. He didn't say anything, but the way his fingers tightened just slightly against my skin told me all I needed to know. He was watching, waiting, enjoying the tension that rippled through the room. Ryan's hand slid up my thigh, his fingers brushing against the delicate fabric of my underwear, and I gasped, the sound escaping before I could stop it. I felt a flush of heat flood my face, my skin burning under the weight of their attention. My heart raced, my pulse thundering in my ears as his fingers traced a slow, deliberate path, teasing, testing the boundaries of what I would allow. Ethan leaned in again, his lips brushing against my jaw, soft and warm, as he whispered, "Tell us if you want to stop." His voice was a low rumble, filled with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. But I didn't want to stop. The rational part of my brain, the part that told me this was wrong, that this could never end well, was drowned out by the overwhelming pull of desire. The need to feel something more, to explore the strange and intoxicating tension that had been building all evening, was too strong to ignore. Mark's fingers slid around to my stomach, holding me in place as he leaned in closer, his lips barely brushing against my ear. "You're in control," he whispered, his breath sending shivers down my spine. "You can stop this anytime." But I didn't stop it. I couldn't. The weight of their eyes, the heat of their bodies pressed so close to mine, the soft pressure of their hands, it was too much, and yet not enough. My pulse raced, my skin tingling with a mixture of anticipation and fear, but beneath it all, there was a hunger I hadn't known existed. A hunger to feel, to experience, to lose myself in the storm of sensations crashing over me. Ryan's lips found my neck, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin there, and I gasped again, my body arching slightly in response. I could feel his fingers slipping under the edge of my underwear, and the sensation sent a wave of heat coursing through me, pooling low in my stomach. My breath hitched, my mind spinning, as I felt Ethan's hand slide up my arm, his fingers brushing against my shoulder. I couldn't think clearly anymore. Every touch, every glance, every whispered word was pulling me deeper into a place I wasn't sure I could come back from. But I didn't want to come back. Not yet. Mark's hand slid lower, his fingers trailing over my hip, and I felt his breath warm against my skin as he whispered, "Let go." And I did. I let go of the fear, the guilt, the nagging voice in the back of my mind that told me this was wrong. In that moment, all that mattered was the way their hands felt on my skin, the way their lips pressed against mine, the way my body responded to every touch, every kiss, every whisper. Ethan's mouth found mine again, his kiss more insistent this time, deeper, as if the unspoken tension between us had finally broken. His hand tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, and I kissed him back with a desperation I hadn't known I was capable of. Ryan's fingers moved with a maddening slowness, teasing me, testing the limits of my self-control, and I felt my body trembling, caught between wanting more and being overwhelmed by the intensity of it all. Mark's hand tightened on my waist, his grip firm but not forceful, and I could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing against my back, grounding me in the chaos of the moment. His presence was a constant reminder that this was real, that he was there, watching, guiding, but never taking control. He was letting me decide, letting me lead. Ryan's hand slid lower, his touch sending a shudder through me, and I bit down on my lip to stifle the moan that threatened to escape. But I couldn't stop the flood of sensations crashing over me, the way my body responded to every touch, every kiss, every movement. I felt alive, more alive than I had in years, and the intensity of it all was both terrifying and exhilarating. Ethan's lips moved from my mouth to my neck, his kisses hot and demanding, and I felt his breath hitch as my fingers curled into his shirt, pulling him closer. I didn't know what I was doing anymore, didn't know where this would lead, but I didn't care. All that mattered was this moment, the way they made me feel, the way I couldn't seem to get enough. Mark's hand slid up to my shoulder, pulling me back against him, and I felt his lips press against the side of my neck, a soft, lingering kiss that made my knees weak. I leaned into him, my body trembling, and I could feel the weight of his approval, the silent understanding that hung in the air between us. I had crossed a line I could never uncross, but in that moment, I didn't care. All that mattered was the way they touched me, the way they looked at me, the way my body responded to every movement, every breath, every kiss. Ryan's hand slid lower, his fingers tracing a slow, deliberate path, and I gasped, my breath catching in my throat as the tension in the room reached a boiling point. Ethan's hand tightened in my hair, his lips pressing harder against mine, and I kissed him back with a hunger that surprised even me. It was wrong, I knew that. But it felt so right, so overwhelming, so intoxicating that I couldn't bring myself to stop. The line had been crossed, and there was no turning back now. And then, everything changed. In a single moment, the room seemed to shift, the tension breaking as reality came crashing back in. Ethan pulled back, his breath ragged, his eyes wide with something that looked like regret. Ryan's hand stilled, his gaze flicking between me and Mark, as if searching for something, some unspoken permission. Mark's hand tightened on my shoulder, and I could feel the shift in him too, the realization that we had gone too far. That we had crossed a line that none of us had truly been prepared for. The room was silent, the weight of what we had done hanging heavy in the air. My heart raced, my body trembling, and I felt a wave of emotions crash over me: guilt, confusion, desire, regret. Mark's voice was soft, barely a whisper, as he broke the silence. "We don't have to go any further." But we already had. The room felt impossibly quiet after Mark spoke, his words hanging in the air like a thin thread, barely holding everything together. The tension was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. But now it was laced with something else: doubt. Ethan had pulled back, his breath still ragged, his hand resting at his side as if he didn't trust himself to touch me again. Ryan's fingers lingered on my thigh, frozen in place, as if he, too, was struggling to decide what to do next. I could feel the weight of their stares, the way their eyes flitted between me and Mark, searching for answers none of us had. My heart was pounding in my chest, my skin still tingling from their touches, and yet a knot of guilt tightened in my stomach, twisting and coiling until it was hard to breathe. I should have said something. I should have stopped it, should have put an end to this dangerous game before it went any further. But instead I sat there, my mind spinning, my emotions warring with one another. I didn't want it to stop, not really. Not when I could still feel the warmth of their hands on my skin, the way their lips had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. But the weight of what we had done, the consequences of crossing that line, was crashing down on me all at once. Mark was still behind me, his hand on my shoulder, his presence grounding me in the chaos of the moment. I could feel the subtle shift in his posture, the way his breath hitched just slightly as the reality of the situation settled in. He was the one who had set this in motion, the one who had given his silent approval. And yet I could sense his hesitation now, his uncertainty about what was happening between us. "We don't have to go any further," he repeated, his voice steady but softer, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as the rest of us. I turned to look at him, searching his face for something, an answer, a reassurance, anything that could make sense of the mess we had made. His eyes were dark, filled with a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite place. But there was no anger there, no jealousy, only a quiet understanding that made my chest ache. Ethan shifted beside me, his fingers brushing against my arm as he sat back, putting more distance between us. His face was flushed, his breathing still uneven, but his expression had changed. The hunger that had been in his eyes moments before had dimmed, replaced by a flicker of doubt. I didn't expect this to happen," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking anywhere but at me. "I thought it was just, a joke." Ryan's hand was still on my thigh, but his grip had loosened, his fingers barely touching me now. He looked at Ethan, then at Mark, as if waiting for one of them to say something, to take control of the situation. But Mark remained silent, his hand slipping from my shoulder as he leaned back, giving me space. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, as I finally found my voice. "We don't have to. We can stop." The words felt strange on my tongue, as if they didn't quite belong to me. I didn't know if I wanted to stop, or if I was just saying what I thought needed to be said. Ryan's eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw something in his gaze that made my pulse quicken. There was still desire there, still that pull between us that hadn't disappeared despite the uncertainty hanging in the air. But there was something else, too, something more cautious, more restrained. He sighed, his hand slipping from my thigh as he sat back, mirroring Ethan's retreat. "We should probably stop," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. It sounded more like an apology than a declaration, as if he wasn't sure if stopping was what he actually wanted. The room was filled with an uncomfortable silence, the weight of everything we had done pressing down on us, making it hard to breathe. My skin still tingled where they had touched me, and I could feel the heat of their presence lingering in the air, but now it was mixed with the sharp sting of guilt. Mark was the first to break the silence, his voice low and measured. "I didn't want anyone to feel pressured," he said, glancing between Ethan and Ryan, then back at me. That's not what this was about. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to. My mind was a mess, a jumble of emotions I couldn't untangle. I didn't regret what had happened, not entirely, but the weight of it, the complexity of it all, was crashing down on me now, making it hard to think clearly. Ethan stood up, running a hand through his hair as he let out a shaky breath. I think I need some air. He shot Mark a look that I couldn't quite decipher, then turned and headed for the door. Ryan followed a moment later, glancing at me one last time before he left, his expression unreadable. And then it was just Mark and me, sitting in the dim light of the living room, the tension between us still thick but now tinged with something else, an awkwardness, a sense of something left unfinished. I turned to him, my heart still racing in my chest. I didn't know it would. I didn't mean for it to get that far. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Neither did I. For a moment, we just sat there, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on us. The silence between us was deafening, filled with all the things we weren't saying, all the emotions we were both too afraid to acknowledge. I didn't want you to feel like you had to do anything, Mark said quietly, his gaze steady. I just thought. I don't know what I thought. I guess I wanted to try something different. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. It's not that I didn't want it, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to handle it. He nodded, his hand reaching for mine, his touch warm and familiar. We can forget it ever happened, he said softly, though there was something in his voice that told me he didn't quite believe that. If that's what you want. I didn't know what I wanted. The intensity of the moment was still with me, the way Ethan's lips had felt on mine, the way Ryan's hands had made my skin burn with anticipation. I couldn't just forget it, not when it had left such a deep imprint on me. I don't know, I whispered, my voice trembling. I don't know what happens next. Mark's hand tightened around mine, his gaze soft but serious. Whatever happens next, we'll figure it out together. I nodded, though the uncertainty still lingered, heavy and unresolved. There was no clear path forward, no easy way to move past what had happened. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder, I felt the weight of our shared silence, the quiet understanding that things between us had changed. There was no going back to the way things were before. We had opened a door that couldn't be closed, and now we had to live with the consequences. But for now, in the stillness of the room, I let myself breathe. We didn't have all the answers, and the future was uncertain, but we were in this together. And maybe that was enough. For now. The stillness of the room clung to us like a heavy blanket, suffocating in its quiet. Mark's hand remained warm in mine, his thumb tracing absent-minded circles over my skin, grounding me to the moment. Yet the weight of what had happened, what had nearly happened, hung between us like a shadow, an unresolved tension that neither of us was ready to confront. I closed my eyes, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside me. The guilt was still there, sharp and bitter, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. But beneath it, something else lingered, something darker, more unsettling. Desire. The memory of Ethan's lips on mine, the feel of Ryan's hands sliding over my skin, the way my body had responded to their touch, it all crashed over me in waves. I couldn't push it away, no matter how hard I tried. Mark shifted beside me, his arms slipping around my shoulders as he pulled me closer. I could feel the steady rise and fall of his chest, the quiet strength of his presence. It should have comforted me. It should have reminded me of everything we had, everything that mattered. But instead, it only heightened the confusion, the tangled mess of emotions that refused to settle. I'm sorry, he said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze was fixed on the flickering flames in the fireplace, his expression distant, as though he, too, was lost in his own thoughts. I frowned, turning to look at him. Why are you sorry? He sighed, his fingers tightening just slightly on my shoulder. For putting you in that position. For suggesting something that. He trailed off, his jaw tightening as if he couldn't quite find the words. I thought it would be different. I thought it would be exciting for both of us. But I didn't think about how complicated it could get. I didn't think about how it would make you feel. I blinked, surprised by the rawness in his voice, the vulnerability he rarely showed. He wasn't blaming me for what had happened. If anything, he was blaming himself, and that realization hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just you, I said softly, my heart aching with the weight of everything that had gone unsaid. I didn't stop it. I could have, but I didn't. His eyes flickered toward me, searching my face for something, an answer, a reassurance, maybe even forgiveness. But do you regret it? I hesitated, the question hanging in the air between us. Did I regret it? The logical part of me, the part that clung to the moral boundaries of our relationship, wanted to say yes. I should regret it. I should feel ashamed for even letting it go as far as it did. But the truth that scared me more than anything, was that I didn't regret it. Not entirely. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how I'm supposed to feel right now. Mark's gaze softened, his hand slipping from my shoulder to take my hand in his. It's okay if you're confused. I'm confused too. He paused, his brow furrowing as he searched for the right words. I just want you to know that whatever you're feeling, it's valid. You don't have to explain yourself to me. His words were meant to comfort me, and in a way they did. But they also left me grappling with the truth I wasn't ready to face, the truth that something inside me had shifted tonight. Something fundamental had changed in the way I saw myself, in the way I saw us. I didn't expect it to feel like that, I whispered, more to myself than to him. I didn't expect to want it. Mark was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing slow, soothing circles over the back of my hand. Neither did I, he finally said. But I think that's what makes this so hard to figure out. We sat in silence for a while, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The fire crackled softly, the flickering light casting shadows on the walls, and for a moment, it almost felt like we were the only two people in the world. But I couldn't shake the memory of Ethan and Ryan, the way their touch had set my skin alight, the way their presence had filled the room with a dangerous, intoxicating energy. I don't want this to ruin what we have, Mark said quietly, his voice breaking through my thoughts. I don't want this to change us. I looked up at him, my heart aching at the sincerity in his eyes. It doesn't have to, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed that. We can move past this. We can just put it behind us. But even as I said the words, I knew it wasn't that simple. We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And no matter how much we tried to pretend otherwise, things between us had already changed. I love you, Mark said softly, his hand tightening around mine. No matter what happens, I want you to know that. I love you. The words should have filled me with warmth, should have eased the tightness in my chest. But instead, they only deepened the confusion, the guilt that gnawed at the edges of my mind. Because I loved him too, deeply, completely. But there was something else now, something I couldn't ignore. I love you too, I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of everything I wasn't saying. Mark leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead, his lips lingering there for a moment before he pulled back. We don't have to figure this out tonight, he said gently. Let's take it one day at a time. I nodded, though my mind was still spinning, still trying to make sense of everything that had happened. One day at a time. Maybe that was all we could do, navigate the uncertainty, the mess we had created, and hope that we could find our way back to each other in the end. But as I leaned into him, resting my head against his shoulder, I couldn't help but wonder if things would ever be the same again. The line had been crossed, the door opened, and I wasn't sure if we could ever truly close it. The future was uncertain, filled with questions I didn't yet have the answers to. But for now, I clung to the comfort of Mark's presence, the quiet promise of his love, and the hope that somehow, we would find our way through this. Yet, as the night stretched on and the house grew quiet around us, the unspoken truth lingered in the air, unresolved, unsettling, and charged with emotions I wasn't ready to face. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The silence that filled the room was heavy, the kind that pressed down on your chest and made it hard to breathe. Mark's arm was still around me, steady and familiar, but even that couldn't quiet the storm of emotions swirling inside me. I felt pulled in 100 different directions, by guilt, by desire, by confusion. The reality of what had happened hung between us, unspoken but ever-present. Mark had said we could take things one day at a time, that we didn't have to figure everything out tonight. But I knew better. Some things couldn't be ignored. Some things demanded answers, even when you weren't ready to give them. I pulled away slightly, just enough to look at him, my heart pounding as I searched his face. He seemed calm, almost unnervingly so, but there was a tension in his jaw, a tightness around his eyes that betrayed the emotions simmering beneath the surface. "Do you really think we can just move past this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mark sighed, his hands slipping from my shoulder to rest in his lap. He stared at the fire for a long moment before answering. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "I want to believe we can. I want to believe that this doesn't have to change us. But the truth is, I don't know." His honesty sent a pang through my chest. I had been hoping for reassurance, for some certainty that we could go back to the way things were before. But deep down, I knew he was right. We had crossed a line, and there was no erasing it. "What if we can't?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What if things are different now?" Mark turned to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. "Then we'll figure it out," he said softly. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." His words were comforting, but they did little to quiet the nagging doubts in my mind. What had happened tonight wasn't something I could easily shake off. It wasn't something I could pretend didn't affect me. The pull I had felt toward Ethan and Ryan had been real, and it wasn't something I could ignore. But neither could I ignore the love I had for Mark, the life we had built together. I leaned back into the cushions, closing my eyes and letting out a shaky breath. My mind was spinning, torn between the past and the present, between what I wanted and what I feared. I wasn't sure how to move forward, wasn't sure what the next step should be. But I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same. We spent the rest of the night in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Eventually, Mark stood up, extending his hand to me. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's go to bed." I nodded, taking his hand and letting him lead me upstairs. The house was quiet, the darkness around us heavy with unspoken tension. When we reached our bedroom, I hesitated for a moment, the weight of everything we had done settling over me like a thick fog. But Mark's hand tightened in mine, and I took comfort in that small gesture. We were in this together, no matter how complicated things had become. We slipped into bed, the sheets cool against my skin. Mark lay beside me, close but not touching, and the space between us felt both comforting and suffocating. I closed my eyes, willing sleep to come, but my mind wouldn't quiet. Images of the evening replayed over and over, their touches, their whispers, the way I had felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. And then, as the minutes stretched into hours, I heard Mark's voice, quiet and unsure. "Do you ever wonder what it could have been like?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. My heart skipped a beat. I turned to look at him in the darkness, barely able to make out the outline of his face. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. "With them," he said, his voice steady but filled with an underlying vulnerability. "Do you ever wonder if, maybe, it could have been different?" I hesitated, the weight of his question pressing down on me. I didn't know how to answer, didn't know if I even wanted to. But the truth, the one I had been trying to avoid, came tumbling out before I could stop it. "Yes," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I wonder." Mark was quiet for a long time, the air between us thick with the tension of the admission. And then, to my surprise, he let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Yeah," he said, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. "Me too." We lay there in the darkness, the reality of what we had both admitted settling over us like a heavy blanket. There was no going back now. We had opened a door, and though we hadn't fully stepped through it, we had crossed the threshold. The temptation, the curiosity, the desire, they were all out in the open now, impossible to ignore. "I don't know what this means," I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. Mark sighed, turning onto his back as he stared up at the ceiling. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But maybe we don't have to know right now." I turned onto my side, facing him in the dim light. "What if it changes everything?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Mark was quiet for a moment before he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. "Maybe it already has," he said softly. "But we'll figure it out. Together." And that was the truth. Whatever happened next, whatever decisions we made in the days to come, we would face it together. The love we shared, the life we had built, it wasn't something I was ready to let go of. But I also couldn't deny that something had shifted inside me tonight, something that couldn't be easily undone. As we lay there in the dark, tangled in the quiet uncertainty of our future, I felt both closer to and further from Mark than I ever had before. The love was still there, strong and steady, but now it was complicated, twisted up in the new emotions we had stirred tonight. In the quiet, we fell asleep, our fingers intertwined, but the questions lingered, unanswered, hovering over us like a storm on the horizon. When morning came, nothing would be the same. But for now, we were together. And that, I hoped, would be enough.